Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. Today, I'm reviewing an action movie that I just finished watching for the very first time on Tubi. And today's action movie I'm going to be reviewing is Murphy's Law from 1986, starring Charles Bronson. And this is a movie that I had heard good things about. And, well, today's Monday, but I actually have work off because of the bad weather. So I figured, on my day off of work, why don't I get caught up on some movies and stuff, and I really liked this one. And so anyways, what's the plot to this movie for those who don't know? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. When a cop is framed for murder and chained to a felon, the duo make a break for it, trying to stay a step ahead of the law and the real killer. So that's basically the plot to this movie, and this movie was directed by a guy named J. Lee Thompson, who actually did quite a few of the later movies starring Charles Bronson. Because of the success he had directing this movie, he actually worked with Charles Bronson directing the fourth Death Wish movie and Kinjite Forbidden Subjects, two movies that I rather enjoy, and I would say this was a really good one. I would definitely, if I did a list of my top 5 favorite Charles Bronson movies, this would definitely be in the top 5. Now, whether it's my favorite or not, I gotta, again, I've only seen the movie once, so I gotta give it time and, stuff to sit, but this would definitely be in my top 5. I could say that for sure. And one thing I will say is that this movie's got a really good cast. You got Charles Bronson as Jack Murphy. You got Robert F. Loynes and Richard Ramones and other actors in this movie. And one thing I do really like about the movie is the action and the story. But without further, and Charles Bronson is definitely one of my favorite action movie stars, and he actually also played a wax statue in the 1953 horror movie House of Wax with Vincent Price. It's a very small appearance, so you could easily miss it, but, Anyways, without further ado, let's get into my review. So, the movie starts off where we're introduced to our main character, Jack Murphy, who is played by Charles Bronson. And in this movie, the movie starts off where there's a girl by the name of Annabella McGee who basically tries to steal Jack Murphy's car, but it doesn't work, and Jack Murphy basically yells, "Hey, you can't do that, that's my car." So then there's an action scene where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, chases her down into an alleyway, and he basically tells her to freeze and that he's a cop, and then I like the part when Annabelle says to him, "Can I ask you a question?" And then Jack Murphy says yes, and then I like the part when Annabella says, "How come all the cops have 2-inch peckers?" And then she punches him, kicks him in the nuts. Which that right there was a rather funny scene. And I like the part when, and then not long after she kicks him in the nuts, she runs away. And one thing I will say I do really like about this movie is the story. And I really do like the chemistry between Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, and Annabelle McGee, played by Kathleen Whithoney, for reasons I'm going to get into. I really like their back and forth dynamic, but anyways, and getting more into what I was talking about the movie, we are about 15 minutes into the movie, and a woman by the name of Joanne Freeman calls Jack Murphy on the phone and says, "I'm going to kill you, but first, I'm going to put you through a living HELL." And this right here sets up a very crucial part of the movie's plot. But before then, 10 minutes into the movie, Joanne ends up killing a person that she works for, showing that this woman is not messing around at all. And I thought that she was a really good villain, and I thought that the actress who played her, Carrie Snodgrass, who I'm not too familiar with as an actress, I thought she gave a really good performance into the movie. And we cut to a scene where basically somebody says something about Charles Bronson's character, Jack Murphy. Someone says something about his ex-wife he doesn't like, so he punches the guy. And basically, the police chief tells him to get in the office and say, what is wrong with you and stuff like that. But not long after that, we cut to a scene where we are 18 minutes into the movie where there's a bad guy by the name of Anthony Cincinzo, I think that's how you say his name, I could be wrong, who is basically the brother of mafia kingpin Frank Vincenzo. And there's a part where Anthony is at the airport and he basically says, nobody move or this woman gets it, basically pointing a gun at a hostage's head in an airport. And then there's a scene after that where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, chases down that guy and he shoots him dead. We then cut to a funeral scene with Anthony's mom crying, saying that she wants that cop, aka Jack Murphy, dead, which sets up a very crucial part to which very much sets up the rest of the movie as mob boss brother Frank seeks revenge against Jack Murphy throughout the course of the rest of the movie. And getting back to the part I was talking about where we're introduced to Annabelle McGee, that thief I mentioned, well, she's a jerk, but she's a funny jerk. And I thought she had some really good one-liners in this movie. Like, for example, there's a scene where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, he's about to buy something at the store, but he stops when he notices that Annabelle McGee is running away from the scene and stuff like that. And he basically aims a gun at her and tells her to get out the bathroom. And then I love the part where she says, "Go ahead, Campbell Crotch, shoot me." And then she tries to hit Jack Murphy, but it doesn't work. And she says, "Gosh, you snot licking donkey fart," and stuff like that. And then she was like, "I fell on the ground." He's like, "Aw, let me help you up." And then he just grabs her by the hair and yanks her up. I thought that scene was rather funny. And then he brings her into the police station and she says, "You'll regret this, dino dork." Like, yes, she's a jerk, but it works because she's a funny jerk, and I thought that the way she delivered her lines were absolutely hilarious and stuff like that. However, we then cut to a part where we are about 30 minutes into the movie where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, leaves a bar. He gets in his car, but then the main villain of the movie, a woman by the name of Joanne Freeman, basically, who's wearing a black outfit and a hat, basically covering up her identity, basically knocks out Jack in his own car and basically shoots Jack's ex-wife and his police partner, basically framing Jack for a murder he didn't do. But before this happens, once Joanne shoots these two people, a person is able to catch the license plate number of the car, which basically places Jack Murphy under arrest, basically framing him for a murder he didn't do. And because of this, Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, he's basically being in a interview room, and he basically says to the police chief, "Why don't you get with any girls? Is it because of your bad breath?" He's like, "Maybe that's why you two boys spend so much time together." Just really upsetting the police chief, which I thought that scene was absolutely hilarious. And then we cut to a scene where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, is basically he's basically handcuffed to Annabelle McGee, played by Kathleen Winthrow. I think that's how you say the actress's name. I could be wrong. And they're basically in a room together. However, they get into a fight. A guard basically tells them, a fight insulting each other. The guard tells them to knock it off. But once the guard gets in, Charles Bronson's character, Jack Murphy, basically knocks out the cop, takes his gun, and basically threatens one of the other cops when he's leaving the room with, basically the room with like a wall around it and a door made out of metal bars. Basically tells one of the cops to drop the keys, hand it over. So then he basically locks the guy in. And then, of course, the whole police are after them. And then there's the whole scene where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, who's with petty thief Annabella McGee, basically gets on the helicopter and stuff like that. And And basically the police say, drop the weapon, Jack, and drop the weapon, Murphy, and get out. And so Murphy does drop the gun, but then he closes the elevator. No, he closes the helicopter and basically flies it away. But of course, Jack Murphy notices that the helicopter not long after runs out of fuel, and Annabella McGee is freaking out thinking they're gonna die. So Jack Murphy lands the helicopter smoothly on top of a barn. And when they try to get out, they basically, another one-liner I really like in this movie is when Annabella McGee basically says, well, I forget the one-liner at the moment, but it was funny. And as soon as, but then Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, says to her, look, you're connected to me at the moment. You're basically chained to me, and where I go, you go. But before Jack Murphy can leave the helicopter, of course, the helicopter falls through the barn and stuff like that. And then there's this group of people who start, beating, basically Annabelle McGee says she wants to have a party, and these guys are like, yeah, let's give her what she wants and stuff like that. And they basically start beating up both of them. But then, of course, Jack Murphy and Annabelle McGee are able to escape. And then they basically go to a friend. There's basically a friend of Jack Murphy's who basically, he's able to treat the wound on Jack Murphy's head. And the guy says to Annabella McGee, he'll be fine, but he's going to have a heck of a concussion for these next few days. And then, of course, basically, Annabella McGee is still arguing with Jack. She leaves the place, and Jack Murphy decides to go after her. But there's a scene where the main villain of the movie, Joanne Freeman, after Jack and Annabella leave the house, basically ends up shooting and killing Jack Murphy's friend and stuff like that. And throughout the course of the movie, like I said, Jack Murphy is trying to figure out, this Los Angeles police detective is trying to figure out, who framed him for murder and stuff like that. And another thing I really like about the villain, you just get the sense of how just pure evil this villain is. She'll kill anyone regardless of who they are, even if there are people who work for her. For example, there's a scene about a little over an hour into the movie where basically, close to an hour into, where she basically, she pretends to be someone else with a wig, but she kills this man by drowning him in a bathtub and throwing a lamp in there, electrocuting him to death. And you just get a sense at how pure evil this villain really is. And then, of course, there's another scene where basically the person who ended up bailing Joanne out of jail is basically looking at a book, and inside the book are, of course, pictures of people. And one of the pictures just so happens to be the partner of Jack that Joanne ended up murdering. And Joanne says to the person who bailed her out of jail, because the person is basically looking at her book with all the pictures of people, she says, I don't understand what you mean by your job. And then Joanne says, you should have never let me out of jail, and stuff like that. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where Joanne Freeman basically has a wire, basically a rope wire thing tied to both of her hands like this, and then she ends up chokes the person to death who bailed her out of jail. You get the sense right there of how evil this woman really is. She is not a force to be reckoned with. And then, of course, there's a whole scene later on in the movie where Jack Murphy ends up calling the police department, and he's like, oh, you son of a B word and stuff like that. And because they think that and then Jack Murphy says, I know who killed this person. And the guy says, yeah, you did. And then Jack Murphy says, hold up, listen, I'm not the one who did it. Basically, it was Joanne Cusack and stuff like that. Well, no, Joanne Freeman, I meant to say, the main villain of the movie. But basically, there's a scene I forgot to mention where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, gets someone at the police station to basically look through a book of people who were let out of jail months prior, and they find the main villain, Joanne Freeman, who they find out was responsible. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where Frank, the guy who I said, and one thing I will say about Frank, this villain, he does do a good job convincing, earlier on in the movie, Jack Murphy and Annabelle McGee break into his house, basically, and Jack Murphy says to him, "You set me up. You framed me for the murder of my ex-wife and my partner," and stuff like that. But he's basically crying and stuff like that, and Annabella McGee says, "I hate to say this, but I think he's telling the truth. I think he's innocent." But I really like the part where Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, is messing with him, and there's no guns in the bullet at all, but he keeps pulling it, and he says, "You're running out of luck," and stuff like that. And then he says to him, "I was just screwing with you. There were no bullets in here." Like, I thought that scene was funny. And then close to the end of the movie, the guy who Jack Murphy said to call says Frank is outside waiting for you, and Jack Murphy feels betrayed. But the main villain of the movie, Joanne Freeman, basically ends up shooting that cop, and Jack Murphy, who is still alive, is trying to reach the gun, but she keeps shooting crossbows at him. And then there's a scene in the movie to where basically what happens is that she basically has Jack's partner tied up with her mouth taped shut so she can't scream, and her arms tied. Basically has her tied up to the bottom of an elevator by the floor, but she pushes the top elevator button, making the elevator slowly go down to her. And Jack Murphy is on a time crunch. He basically has to rescue her before an elevator crushes her to death, which he does successfully manage to do. But the bad guy of the movie, Joanne Freeman, basically ends up shooting Annabelle McGee with a crossbow. And this obviously really upsets Jack Murphy because they didn't start off as friends, but they started to like each other over time and stuff like that. And then he decides to get revenge on the main bad guy. And then, of course, there's the part where the bad guy is swinging the axe at Charles Bronson's character, Jack, misses it once, and then gets him in the chest a second time, but only slightly on the chest. And then Jack Murphy kicks her down some stairs, and she does fall over an edge, but she's saved, not by Jack Murphy, but basically there's a fire axe holding, basically hanging off of the side of a ledge, basically stuck underneath a wall, which is holding her up, but she's slowly slipping to her death, and she says, "Please, Jack Murphy, help me." And then she says, "You go to HELL." And then I love the part when Jack Murphy, played by Charles Bronson, says, "You first." And then she slips and then she falls. And then we cut to a part where Jack Murphy and Annabelle McGee, who are basically inside of an ambulance truck, we see that they're alive and stuff like that. And Annabelle McGee basically says, they have a back and forth banter and stuff like that, and they're happy to see each other in the movie end. So yeah, at the end of the day, I thought Murphy's Law was a really good action movie from the 1980s. Now that I've seen this, I would definitely, if I did a list of my top 10 favorite movies of 1986, this would definitely be on there. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Murphy's Law a 9 out of 10. So yeah, anyways guys, that was my review of Murphy's Law, and yeah. I'm gonna end this review here because it's a little after 12 and I haven't eaten lunch yet, and I'm getting rather hungry. So we'll catch you guys later. Bye bye now.